Having only one of the doors on our blueprint actor open up is certainly okay if that is the effect that we want. As it stands though, I would much prefer to go with the traditional double sliding door for this one. And so with that in mind, we have of course already done the groundwork needed in order to make this a simple and painless process. To make a start then, we will want to target the second door static mesh. And so, from the components section of the UI, let's drag out a reference to our auto door R static mesh. And then, from the variables section of the My Blueprint tab, click and drag on the door R start variable, and then choose the get option from the list that appears. Just as with the first door, not only do we need this second door starting position stored inside the variable that we have here, but we also need to distinguish the static mesh that will be the target of our animation, in this case, the auto door R component. Happily, we can actually reuse work that we have already done here, and so let's select the original Get Relative Transform, Set Relative Location, and Float Lerp nodes by holding down the Control key and clicking on them, and then press Ctrl plus W in order to create duplicates of them. After which, we can move them into place next to our reference and variable nodes. Whenever possible, it is better to save time by copying rather than creating nodes from scratch, given that here we would have to run through the slightly laborious process of re-splitting the pins. Whereas duplicating the existing nodes, as they are not specific to either door, lets us skip this step as it has already been done. We now want to make sure that the nodes have the correct mesh target when they are called into action. And so after clicking and dragging from the auto door R node's output, we can pipe into both the relative transform and relative location target inputs. Obviously, we will want to change the static mesh that these nodes will affect, and so changing the target input is the key to making sure that this blueprint works as intended. The lerp node that we have copied needs to work for our second door, of course, which means making sure that its inputs give the correct location values. And so, let's drag out from the door R start variable, and then pipe it into the A input on the float lerp node. After which, we can drag a second time, only this time releasing the mouse over some empty space in the graph. In the search field that appears, let's type the plus icon, and then choose the float addition node from the list. Because we want the animation to run in the opposite direction to our first door, we need to make sure that we use an addition float node rather than the subtraction version that we used earlier. Although, thankfully, these nodes are easy enough to test and swap around if we find that our door animation is running in the wrong direction. So don't worry too much if that happens. Simply swap where they sit in the blueprint flow. With a new maths node in place, we next want to adjust how much it offsets the door motion by. And so, let's set the float addition node's B value to 90, and then pipe its output into the B slot of the lerp node. After which, we can pipe the lerp node's output into our newly created relative location node's new location Y input. If we find that our animation isn't working correctly, it's always good to check that we have typed the correct value into the addition node, as these kinds of nodes are easily overlooked or missed, especially so in bigger or more complex graphs. The timeline node that we created earlier hasn't finished its job in our blueprint just yet though. And so, on the timeline node, let's click and drag on the open float value output, and then pipe it into our newly created lerp node's alpha input. We can finish by piping our original relative location output into the execution input of our new relative location node. We need to make sure that we are controlling this lerp node with the same timeline float value, so as to ensure that the doors open in unison. This being applicable for the static mesh blueprint that I am aiming to create here. If you are wanting, for example, to create a door that has an offset animation instead, then you could just as easily use a second timeline to drive the other door's lerp alpha in order to create such an effect. We have also appended the second door's relative location node to the end of the flow. But to the player or client viewing this, it will of course look as if both doors open at the same time, simply because of the way in which the blueprint executes. What we've managed to do here then is successfully use the logic that we created for the first of our sliding doors to very quickly set up a second, whilst at the same time making sure that we have it travelling in the correct direction.